For this video, I want to talk to you about how can we find the 6 trig functions when we are given a point on a circle. Okay, so what we have here is we are given the point -5, -3 on the circle. The circle is centered at the origin. So what that tells us is we want to make a right triangle out of the points. So our -3 is going to be dropping down here, and our -5 is going to form the other leg, and then what we need is the hypotenuse. Okay, so our reference angle is going to be this angle right here that is formed by the x-axis and the hypotenuse. So that's the reference angle that we are going to be using in order to find the 6 trig functions. In order to find them, we do need to find the hypotenuse, and so if you think about it, since this is a right triangle, we can use the Pythagorean theorem where a squared plus b squared equals c squared, and c would represent our hypotenuse length. So since we're going to be solving for c, we are going to technically just be doing the square root of a squared plus b squared. So let's go ahead and do that to find the hypotenuse. All right, so the hypotenuse is going to be -3 squared plus -5 squared. And so if we simplify that, that gives us 9 plus 25, which is the square root of 34. Okay, so this side over here is going to be the square root of 34. Let me find a better color to write on here. All right, so now we just need to go through, and if you remember from right triangle trig that sine is going to be the opposite over the hypotenuse, cosine is going to be the adjacent over the hypotenuse, and tangent is going to be the opposite over the adjacent. So if you can remember SOHCAHTOA, that will help you with the right triangle trig. Okay, so what we have is we can say that sine of theta is going to equal the opposite side, so the opposite of theta is -3, over the hypotenuse, which is the square root of 34. And we're just going to leave this as an exact answer rather than a decimal approximation, because a lot of times in trigs it makes it easier if we have it as an exact value. Okay, we are not allowed most of the time to leave it with a radical in the denominator, so we do have to rationalize the denominator by multiplying both the numerator and the denominator by the square root of 34. So essentially all we're doing is multiplying by 1, so it doesn't change it at all. It just makes it so that it's in the correct form. So we would end up with -3 times the square root of 34 over 34. So this would be the exact answer that you would be plugging in. I'm only going to go over exact answers. If they do want it as a decimal approximation, you would just plug this into your calculator. All right, so moving on to the next one. Our next one is cosine. And cosine of theta, remember, is going to be our adjacent, which means the side next to, but not the hypotenuse. So that would be the -5 over the square root of 34. And we would do the same process where we multiply both the numerator and the denominator by the square root of 34 to get it in the correct form. So the answer to this one is -5 square root 34 over 34. All right. Tangent is the next one. And so these are our 3 main trig functions that we talk about, and then we will talk about the reciprocal functions for each of these. Okay, so tangent is our next one. Remember that tangent is the opposite, so the opposite of this angle, opposite is always across from, is going to be -3 over the adjacent, which is the side next to, so that would be -3 over -5, which would simplify to 3 over 5. Technically, both of them are the same, so you could write it, but most of the time you are required to simplify, especially if you are using an online homework platform that is super picky about how you enter your answers in. All right, so moving on into the reciprocal functions, remember that the reciprocal functions are cosecant, This is the reciprocal of sine. So since sine is opposite over hypotenuse, this is going to be hypotenuse over opposite. So we would just do the, so this one is going to be hypotenuse over the opposite since it's the reciprocal of sine. So we would say that this is going to be the square root of 34 divided by -3, and it really doesn't matter where you put the negative, whether it's out in front, in the numerator, the denominator, it all ends up being equivalent expressions. All right, so the next one is secant, and secant of theta is the reciprocal of cosine. So since cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse, this one is going to be hypotenuse over adjacent. So for this one, we would do the square root of 34 over -5, and that is our answer for secant. We don't have to do anything to simplify because the radical is in the numerator, which is perfectly acceptable. All right, and then our last one that we need to find is cotangent. And cotangent of theta is the reciprocal function for tangent, and since tangent is opposite over adjacent, this one is just going to be the adjacent over the opposite. Okay, so the cotangent, we would just switch the 3 over 5 to make it 5 over 3, and that would be your final answer. So if it asks you to find the 6 trig functions, that is what you would do. Sometimes you might be asked just to find one of them. Sometimes you might just be asked to find the first 3, sine, cosine, tangent, but I did want to go over all of them just in case. As always, thanks for watching. If you have any questions, please let me know. If there are additional topics that you need me to cover, please let me know that as well.